Talk to my deaf son, mocked the millionaire CEO. The waitress's words stop his breath. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main characters. Mark Anderson, a self-made millionaire, had everything a man could wish for. He was a titan in the business world, his name synonymous with power, wealth, and success. With his sharp suits, flawless charisma, and an aura that demanded respect, he ruled his empire with an iron fist. But despite all of his achievements, Mark couldn't escape the feeling that something was missing. At 35, he had everything, except for someone to share it with. His life was filled with business meetings, boardroom deals, and strategies that made millions, but it left no room for personal connections. And this, he often thought, was just the way things had to be. A workaholic, he dismissed the idea of romantic relationships. They were distractions, weaknesses, things that were beneath him. On a rainy Tuesday evening, Mark was in a posh restaurant in Manhattan, a place where only the elite dined. He had been waiting for his business partner, who was late for their dinner meeting, but Mark wasn't bothered. After all, his time was worth more than most people's entire year's salary. As he sat alone at the corner table, scrolling through emails on his phone, his thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of the restaurant's door chiming. Mark looked up, his gaze quickly scanning the new arrival. She was a waitress, nothing special, in a black vest and white shirt. Her name was Emily Parker. She had been working at this upscale restaurant for a year, and like all the other staff, she was invisible to the guests, merely a fixture in the background. But something about Emily caught Mark's attention, even though he would never admit it. Her eyes, warm and intelligent, seemed to see through the pretentious world around her. She wasn't fazed by the luxury of the place, the rich customers, or the air of superiority. Emily was a woman of few words, and she moved through the restaurant with a quiet grace, as if she belonged to a world far removed from this one. She was here because she had to be. She was a single mother, working long hours just to make ends meet, and her shift that night was no exception. When Emily approached Mark's table, she greeted him with a polite smile and placed a glass of water in front of him. Mark didn't pay much attention to her at first, his mind consumed with the business deals he had to finalize. But when he saw her again, his irritation bubbled up. He had been waiting far too long, and his partner still wasn't there. Emily, unaware of his growing impatience, returned to check on him. Mark smirked, thinking of how he could test her. "Tell me, can you speak to my son?" he asked, a sarcastic edge in his voice. "He's deaf. Do you know sign language?" Emily hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by the question. But her professional demeanor never wavered. She nodded and replied, "I can communicate with him, yes." Mark's smirk grew. "Really? Prove it," he said, his tone mocking. Emily, however, didn't flinch. She walked over to where Lucas, his young son, was sitting quietly at the other end of the table, his crutches leaning against the chair. She knelt down beside him and began to speak in fluent sign language, the words flowing naturally. Mark froze. His breath caught in his chest as he watched Emily speak to his son, completely unaware that she was not just a waitress, but someone with an extraordinary talent. The simple exchange between Emily and Lucas made Mark feel a strange sense of awe. How could someone like her know so much? This woman, who he had dismissed as just another waitress, had shown him a side of life he had never considered. As Emily finished her brief conversation with Lucas, Mark stood up, unable to contain his curiosity. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low. Emily looked up at him, a small smile on her face. "Just a waitress with a few skills," she replied softly, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that took him off guard. Mark's mind raced as he processed what had just happened. This woman had not only proven him wrong, but had also reminded him that sometimes the people we least expect have the power to teach us the most. As Emily walked away, Mark couldn't shake the image of her. He had expected to find her nervous, intimidated, perhaps even ashamed of her position, but what he saw was something completely different. She moved with confidence, her posture straight and calm, as though she belonged in the same room as him. despite their obvious differences in status. The moment had left him reeling, a feeling he rarely experienced. He had dealt with CEOs, billionaires, and power players all his life, but here was this woman, just a waitress, who had somehow managed to hold her ground and teach him a lesson without saying a word. He leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning as he considered what had just happened. He was the CEO of Anderson Technologies, a company worth billions. His success was built on control, precision, and the ability to manipulate every situation in his favor. Yet, for the first time in a long while, he felt vulnerable. He stared down at the table, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the edge of his glass, trying to process everything. The waiter came by, offering to refill his drink, but Mark declined with a quick shake of his head. His thoughts were consumed by Emily. What was her story? Who was she really? He had heard her mention studying linguistics, but what else did she hide? The curiosity gnawed at him, something he wasn't used to feeling. As he sat there, mulling over the strange encounter, Lucas, his son, sat quietly across from him. The boy was still trying to process everything around him. Mark had always struggled to connect with him. As much as he loved his son, the boy's deafness was something that Mark could never fully understand. He had done everything for Lucas, sent him to the best specialists, the best schools, but nothing seemed to work. The distance between them remained, and Mark wondered if it always would. When Emily spoke with Lucas, however, Mark had seen something shift. For the first time, someone had broken through the barrier. Emily had communicated with his son like it was the most natural thing in the world. He had seen Lucas' eyes light up, as though he finally felt heard. That was something Mark couldn't do, no matter how much he tried. That moment had left him with a mix of admiration and frustration. He had always prided himself on being in control, on being the one to fix things, but Emily had done something he couldn't. She had connected with his son in a way he never could. It was a humbling thought. Mark stood up abruptly, needing to clear his head. He walked over to the bar, trying to shake off the feeling that was threatening to consume him. The bartender nodded at him, but Mark didn't feel like talking. He just wanted to be alone with his thoughts. As he stood there, staring at his reflection in the mirror behind the bar, he heard a voice behind him. "Mr. Anderson." He turned to find Emily standing in the doorway, her uniform neatly pressed, her expression calm. "I just wanted to thank you," she said softly. Mark raised an eyebrow. "Thank me?" he asked, his voice laced with confusion. "For being kind to Lucas. He doesn't get that often," Emily explained. Mark was caught off guard. "You're welcome," he replied, his voice softer than usual. He wasn't sure what else to say. "It's not often people take the time to understand him," Emily continued. "Most people just see him as different. But you tried. That's all he really needs. Someone who tries." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. He had never really thought about it that way before. He had always tried to fix things, always tried to find solutions. But maybe what Lucas needed wasn't a solution at all. Maybe what he needed was someone to simply be there, to try. It was a humbling realization, and Mark found himself speechless for a moment. Emily took a step back, her expression thoughtful. "I should get back to work," she said quietly, but before she turned to leave, Mark spoke again. "Wait," he called out, his voice more firm than before. Emily turned, a slight look of surprise on her face. "I'd like to talk to you," Mark said, his tone softening. "About everything. I don't think I really understand, but maybe I can learn." Emily hesitated, her gaze shifting briefly to Lucas, who was still sitting quietly at the table. Then, she nodded. "I'll be here until close. If you want to talk then, I'll be happy to." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Mark standing there, deep in thought. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had something to learn. Something important. Something he hadn't even realized he was missing. As the evening continued, Mark sat at the bar, staring into his glass, but his mind was far from the whiskey in front of him. He was thinking about Emily, about the conversation they'd had earlier, and about the connection that had unexpectedly formed between them. He didn't know why he was so intrigued by her, but he couldn't deny that something about her was different. In a world where people usually only saw him for his wealth and status, Emily had seen him for who he really was, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't just another powerful businessman. He was a person. He glanced at his watch and stood up, his decision made. He walked over to the table where Emily was still working, her eyes focused on her tasks as she moved with efficiency and grace. When she saw him approaching, her expression was neutral, as if she was used to seeing people like him come and go. "You're back," she said softly, her tone polite but distant. "I told you I'd be here." Mark nodded, feeling a strange nervousness in his chest. This was not like him. He was always in control, always the one to dictate the terms. But now he felt like he was stepping into unknown territory. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," Mark began, his voice quieter than usual. Emily raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "About Lucas?" she asked, her gaze softening for a moment. "Yes," Mark replied, his voice steadying. "About how I've been approaching everything. I've always been so focused on solutions, on fixing problems, but I think I've been missing something important." Emily looked at him for a moment, as if trying to gauge whether he was sincere. She didn't say anything at first, but her silence was enough for Mark to continue. "I've been trying to fix Lucas, to make him fit into a world that doesn't understand him. But maybe what he needs isn't a fix at all. Maybe what he needs is someone to understand him, just like you do." Emily's expression softened, and for a brief moment, Mark saw something in her eyes, something that resembled sympathy. She nodded slowly, understanding his words more than he could have expected. "It's not about fixing him, Mark," she said quietly. "It's about accepting him for who he is, and being there for him, even when you don't have all the answers." Mark felt a lump form in his throat, and for a moment, he couldn't find the words to respond. He had always thought of himself as someone who could control everything. But here he was, talking to a waitress who had just taught him a valuable lesson about parenting and compassion. Emily glanced at the clock and then back at Mark, breaking the silence. "I should get back to work. It's getting busy." Mark nodded, still processing everything she had just said. "Of course," he said. But before she could turn away, he stopped her. "I don't want to just be the guy who offers money, Emily," Mark said, his voice almost hesitant. "I want to make a real difference. Not just for Lucas, but for myself. I've spent so many years building my empire, but now I feel like I've missed out on the things that really matter." Emily met his gaze, her eyes thoughtful. "What are you asking, Mark?" she asked softly. "I want to learn," he said, his tone serious. "I want to understand more about Lucas, more about the world outside of my own bubble. And I think you can help me with that." Emily studied him for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. Finally, she nodded, her expression softening. "I can help, but you have to be willing to listen. It won't be easy, and it's not something you can fix overnight." Mark smiled faintly, his heart lightened by her words. "I know, but I'm ready to try." Emily gave a small nod before turning away to attend to her other tables. Mark stood there for a moment, watching her, feeling a strange sense of hope for the first time in years. He had never been the type to ask for help, but with Emily, he felt like maybe it wasn't such a bad thing. As the night went on, Mark found himself reflecting on his conversation with Emily. He had spent so many years chasing success, believing that if he just kept pushing forward, he would eventually find happiness. But now, for the first time, he was realizing that happiness wasn't something to chase. It was something to be built, step by step, with the people who truly mattered. And for the first time in a long while, Mark felt like he was on the right path. The following days passed, and Mark found himself returning to the restaurant more frequently, even when there were no meetings planned. He couldn't explain it, but there was something magnetic about Emily, something that drew him back every time. It wasn't just her quiet strength or the way she could talk to his son. It was something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years. A sense of connection, of being understood, even if it was only in fleeting moments. He was used to people needing him, looking up to him, but Emily didn't do that. She didn't treat him like he was any different from anyone else. She treated him like a person. It was a feeling he couldn't quite shake, and it left him feeling unsettled yet intrigued. One evening, as he sat at the bar again, Emily came over to check on him, and this time, he wasn't going to wait. "Emily, do you have time to talk?" he asked, his voice steady. She raised an eyebrow, surprised by his directness. "Of course," she replied, her tone warm. Mark gestured to the empty seat beside him. "I was hoping we could talk about Lucas. And about everything else." Emily hesitated for a moment, but then sat down beside him, her eyes meeting his with a mix of curiosity and caution. "What about Lucas?" she asked. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Mark began. "I've always treated him like a problem that needed fixing, but I think I've been going about it all wrong. I want to change how I approach him, how I connect with him. I want to be there for him, not just as his father, but as someone who truly understands him. Emily nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. That's a good start, she said quietly. But it's not just about changing how you approach him. It's about changing how you see him. He's not broken, Mark. He's just different. And that difference is something to be celebrated, not fixed. Mark felt a lump form in his throat. He had never heard anyone say that to him before. He had always seen Lucas's deafness as something that needed to be overcome, something that made his son different in a way that was somehow less. But hearing Emily's words, hearing them come from someone who had truly understood him, made him see everything in a new light. You're right, Mark said quietly. I've been so focused on what I thought was normal that I missed what really mattered. Emily smiled softly, her eyes kind. It's easy to fall into that trap. But the most important thing is being there, being present. And you're already doing that. You just have to keep doing it, day by day. Mark took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the conversation settle in. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. Not just as a father, but as a person. I'm going to try, he said, his voice steady. I'm going to do better for him. For both of us. Emily nodded. And for yourself too, Mark. You can't pour from an empty cup. You need to take care of yourself too. Mark's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them, in that quiet moment of understanding. He had been so caught up in his own success, his own world, that he had forgotten the importance of slowing down, of really living. He didn't know where this was going, or what it meant, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was starting to understand. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but the weight of their words lingered in the air. Mark found himself laughing more freely than he had in ages, the tension in his shoulders easing. As the night wore on, he realized something. Emily hadn't just changed how he saw Lucas. She had changed how he saw himself. He wasn't just the billionaire CEO. He was a father. He was a person who still had a lot to learn, but he was willing to learn it. And that, he realized, was the most important thing of all. As the days went on, Mark found himself spending more time with Lucas, taking a more active role in his son's life. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of frustration, but something had changed within him. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was genuinely trying. It was a slow process, but it was progress. He had Emily to thank for that. Her words had opened his eyes in a way that no business deal or conference ever had. And now, he was starting to see his son not as someone to fix, but as someone to support and understand. One afternoon, after school, Mark decided to take Lucas to the park. It was a small gesture, but it felt important. He wanted to show his son that he was there for him, that he wasn't just the guy who showed up with solutions, but the guy who was willing to listen. They sat on a bench together, the cool breeze rustling the leaves in the trees. Mark watched as Lucas interacted with the other kids, using his sign language to communicate with them. Mark had never been one to shy away from challenges, but seeing his son interact with the world so confidently, despite his differences, made him feel a sense of pride that he had never experienced before. Emily's words echoed in his mind. Asterisk, it's about accepting him for who he is. Asterisk, that was the key. It wasn't about trying to change Lucas. It was about seeing him for the incredible person he already was. After a while, Lucas turned to Mark and signed something. A simple question. Asterisk, are you happy? Asterisk, Mark was taken aback at first. He had never really thought about that question in the context of his relationship with Lucas. Asterisk, am I happy? Asterisk, he thought. He had always focused on success, on achievements, on what was next. But now, sitting there with his son, watching him laugh and play, he realized that happiness wasn't found in the next business deal or the next big move. It was in moments like this, in the simple act of being present, of being there for someone who needed him. I am now. Mark signed back, smiling as he reached out to ruffle Lucas's hair. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental. Later that evening, after the park, Mark went to the restaurant again, hoping to talk to Emily. When he walked in, he saw her in the back, wiping down tables. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if she would even want to talk to him. But as soon as she saw him, she smiled, and that familiar warmth spread through him. Mark, she said, her voice soft and welcoming. What brings you back here? Mark took a deep breath. I just wanted to thank you, he said, his voice genuine. For everything. For helping me see what I was missing. I've been trying to be a better father, and it's because of you. You made me realize that I didn't need to fix Lucas. I just needed to be there. Emily's smile widened, and for a moment, Mark felt like she could see right through him, like she understood exactly what he was saying without him needing to say more. I'm glad to hear that, Mark, she replied softly. It's not easy, but you're on the right track. Mark felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just focused on being the CEO. He was focused on being a father, a better father, to his son. And that, he realized, was something that would always matter more than anything else. As he sat down at a table near the window, waiting for Emily to bring him his drink, Mark looked out at the busy streets of New York. The world outside was as chaotic as ever, but for the first time, he felt a sense of peace. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what the future would hold. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to make the same mistakes again. He was going to keep trying, keep learning, and keep being there for Lucas. And that was enough for now. Weeks passed, and Mark found himself more at peace with his new approach to life and fatherhood. His relationship with Lucas was growing stronger, and while there were still challenges, Mark knew he was on the right path. He wasn't perfect, but he was present. That was all that mattered. One evening, after a particularly difficult day at work, Mark decided to visit the restaurant again. It had become a routine, one that he looked forward to. When he entered, he immediately spotted Emily in the back, busy with orders. She looked up for a moment and smiled when she saw him. It was a smile that had become familiar, one that felt like an unspoken understanding. Mark walked over to the counter, and she greeted him with a polite nod. "Mark, how's everything going?" she asked, her voice soft. Mark smiled back, feeling a warmth in his chest. "Good. Better than I expected, honestly. I've been spending more time with Lucas. It's not always easy, but I'm trying." Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You're doing great," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "Sometimes, the hardest part is just showing up. And you're doing that." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't expected to hear those words, but they meant more to him than he could express. He had always prided himself on his success in business, but this, being there for his son, was something entirely different. It felt like something worth fighting for. "Thank you, Emily," he said quietly, his voice filled with gratitude. "You've been a big part of helping me see things differently." Emily smiled again, her eyes warm. "I'm glad I could help," she said. "It's not always easy, but it's worth it. And you're doing it. You're making a difference." Mark stood there for a moment, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. This wasn't a world he was used to, one where things weren't measured by success or profit, but it was a world he was starting to embrace. As he sat down at a table near the window, he reflected on how far he had come. It wasn't about the money or the titles anymore. It was about being a better father, a better person. And for the first time, he felt like he was truly starting to understand what it meant to live. As the night wore on, Mark found himself more at ease than he had been in years. He was no longer consumed by his business empire or driven by the need to be in control. He had learned to let go, to accept that he didn't have all the answers, but that was okay. He didn't need to fix everything. Sometimes, just being there was enough. The sound of laughter from across the room caught his attention. It was Lucas, sitting with a group of kids. Mark watched as his son communicated with them using sign language. His face lit up with excitement. For the first time, Mark saw his son not as someone who needed to be fixed, but as someone who was thriving in his own way. It was a moment of clarity for Mark. He didn't need to change Lucas. He just needed to be there for him, to support him, and to love him unconditionally. Emily walked over to his table, bringing him his usual drink. She set it down in front of him, and for a moment, they simply sat in silence. Mark looked up at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I can't thank you enough, Emily," he said softly, "for everything. You've helped me see things in a way I never thought possible." Emily smiled, her eyes kind. "I'm just glad I could be there for you, Mark. You've done all the hard work. You just needed a little guidance." Mark nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle within him. He had made mistakes, but he was finally on the path to making things right. And as he sat there, watching Lucas interact with his new friends, he knew that he was exactly where he needed to be. This wasn't the life he had envisioned when he first started his journey, but it was a life he was proud of. For the first time, Mark felt truly content, knowing that the most important things in life weren't measured by success or wealth, but by the relationships we build and the love we give. And that, he realized, was more valuable than anything money could buy. It had been a few months since Mark had truly started to embrace his new life, the life where he was not just a billionaire CEO, but a father learning to connect with his son. Every day brought new challenges, but also new victories. Lucas was flourishing in his own way, and Mark was right there beside him every step of the way. They spent more time together, doing simple things like playing catch in the backyard, watching movies, or just talking. Mark had stopped seeing his son's deafness as a barrier and started seeing it as a unique part of who he was. One afternoon, as Mark was leaving his office, he received a call from Emily. "Hey, Mark, are you free later? Lucas has something he wants to show you," she said, her voice cheerful. Mark felt a smile tug at his lips. "I'll be there," he replied. When he arrived at the restaurant, he found Emily waiting for him. She looked up and waved, and for the first time, Mark noticed the warmth in her expression, a kindness that had become all too familiar over the past few months. "Lucas is in the back," she said, guiding him to the kitchen area. As they walked, Mark could hear the sound of laughter and chatter in the restaurant. It was a busy evening, but Emily's presence seemed to calm the space. She moved with a quiet grace, effortlessly balancing her duties while still making time for others. When they reached the back, Mark saw Lucas sitting at a table, a piece of paper in front of him. He looked up when Mark walked in, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "Dad, look," Lucas signed, his hands moving quickly. Mark stepped closer, his heart racing. He had learned enough sign language to understand his son's basic communication, but seeing it in action was still a reminder of how far he had come. Lucas pointed to the paper, and Mark saw what it was, a drawing. It was a picture of their family, Mark and Lucas standing side by side, with Emily standing next to them. "It's us," Lucas signed, smiling proudly. Mark's breath caught in his throat. It was a simple drawing, but it meant everything. It wasn't just a family portrait. It was a representation of how far they had come, how much they had grown together. For the first time in a long time, Mark felt truly at peace. He had been so focused on his own success, his own empire, that he had forgotten what really mattered. But now, seeing Lucas's drawing, seeing the love and connection in his son's eyes, Mark knew that he had made the right choice. He wasn't just a CEO anymore. He was a father, and that was something far more important than any deal or acquisition. Emily watched quietly as Mark looked at the drawing, a soft smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "He's really come a long way," she said, her voice gentle. Mark looked up at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You've helped more than you know," he said quietly. "I didn't realize what I was missing until I started to really see him." Emily nodded. "That's all anyone needs, Mark. To be seen. For who they are." Mark stood there for a moment, taking in the scene before him. He had everything he had ever wanted: money, power, success. But now he realized that none of that mattered as much as the simple things, the moments with his son, the connection with Emily. He was beginning to understand the true value of life, of love, and of being present for those who mattered most. As they stood together, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't sure where this new journey would take him, but for the first time, he felt ready. Ready to be the father Lucas deserved, and to build a future that was defined by love, not just by success. He looked at Emily, who had quietly stepped back, allowing him and Lucas to share this moment. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. Emily smiled warmly. "You don't have to thank me, Mark. You're doing all the work." Mark nodded, his heart full. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just trying to build something for the world. He was building something for his family. And that was enough. Mark stood by the window in his office, gazing out at the New York skyline. The city stretched out before him, alive with movement and energy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt disconnected from it all. His mind was no longer consumed with deals and numbers. His thoughts kept drifting back to Lucas and Emily, and the new world he had discovered, one where love, patience, and understanding mattered more than anything else. The past few months had been transformative for Mark. He had spent years building his empire, pushing aside everything else in the pursuit of success. But now, he saw everything in a new light. He wasn't just the CEO of Anderson Technologies anymore. He was a father. He was a man who had learned the importance of connection, of being present. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of doubt, but Mark knew he was finally on the right path. As he stood there, his phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from Emily. Asterisk, can you come by later? Lucas wants to talk to you about something. Asterisk Mark felt a smile tug at his lips. He had learned to look forward to these small moments with his son, moments that meant more to him than any meeting or contract ever could. He quickly replied, Asterisk, I'll be there in an hour. Asterisk later that evening, Mark arrived at the restaurant. It was a quieter night, with fewer customers, which gave him the perfect chance to spend some time with Lucas. When he walked in, he spotted Emily behind the counter, organizing some paperwork. She looked up and gave him a warm smile. He's in the back, she said, nodding toward the kitchen. Mark walked over to the back of the restaurant, where Lucas was waiting. The moment Lucas saw him, he signed eagerly, Asterisk Dad. I have something to show you. Asterisk Mark's heart swelled. What is it, buddy? He asked as he sat down beside his son. Lucas handed him a piece of paper. It was another drawing, but this one was different from the last. It wasn't just a family portrait. It was a scene, Mark and Lucas standing together, surrounded by a field of flowers, both of them smiling. Emily had been right. It wasn't about fixing Lucas or making him fit into a world that didn't understand him. It was about embracing who he was and being there to support him. This is amazing, Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. He hugged Lucas tightly, not caring who was watching. You're so talented, buddy. I'm proud of you. Lucas smiled, his eyes shining with happiness. I want to go to art school someday, he signed, his hands moving quickly. Mark looked at Emily, who was standing nearby, watching the exchange with a soft smile on her face. He could see the pride in her eyes, too. Emily had always believed in Lucas, even when Mark didn't know how to. Art school? Mark asked, his voice full of warmth. That sounds like an amazing idea, Lucas. If that's what you want, we'll make it happen. Emily walked over, joining them at the table. He's been drawing for months now, she said softly. He's really good, but he just needed someone to believe in him. Mark nodded, his heart swelling even more. I believe in him. I always will. For the first time, Mark realized that this was his true purpose. Not to run a company or make millions, but to be there for his son, to guide him and support him as he followed his dreams. And with Emily by his side, he knew they could do anything. As the evening went on, Mark, Lucas, and Emily sat together, talking about the future. They discussed art school, what it would take, and how they could help Lucas achieve his goals. Mark was no longer the man who measured success by the size of his company or the deals he closed. He was a father, a man who was finally understanding what it meant to truly live. It wasn't about the money or the power. It was about the people in his life, the ones who mattered most. And in that moment, he knew that he had found something more valuable than anything he could have ever built in the business world. A family, a future, and love. Love that would guide them through whatever came next. The months that followed were a time of transformation for Mark, Lucas, and Emily. The changes were subtle at first, but as time passed, Mark began to realize just how much his life had shifted. He spent more time with Lucas, attending parent-teacher conferences, helping with homework, and even learning a bit more sign language so he could communicate more effectively with his son. It wasn't always easy, and there were times when Mark felt out of his depth, but he was determined to keep trying. And every time he saw Lucas smile or hear him laugh, Mark knew it was worth it. Emily continued to play a vital role in their lives, offering support and guidance whenever needed. Her belief in Lucas never wavered, and her quiet strength became a steady presence in their home. Over time, Mark found himself relying on her more and more, not just for advice on raising Lucas, but for her perspective on life. They had formed a bond that was built on mutual respect and understanding. One evening, as Mark and Emily sat together in the living room, Lucas was in his room, working on another drawing. The soft hum of the evening filled the room, and for a moment, Mark felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Emily turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "How are you really doing, Mark?" she asked, her voice gentle. Mark looked at her for a long moment, unsure of how to answer. He had spent so much time focusing on the external aspects of his life, the business, the deals, the success, that he hadn't taken much time to reflect on how he was doing inside. But as he sat there with Emily, he realized that things were different now. He was different. "I'm better," he said slowly, his voice sincere. "I've been so focused on the wrong things for so long. But now, I see what really matters. Lucas, you, this family. That's what I want to focus on." Emily smiled softly, her eyes warm. You've come a long way, Mark. I'm proud of you. Mark felt a surge of gratitude. For the first time, he didn't feel like he had to prove anything to anyone. He wasn't just a CEO or a businessman. He was a father. He was a partner. He was a person who was learning, growing, and figuring things out along the way. And that was enough. A few weeks later, Mark found himself at another milestone, Lucas's first art show. It was a small event at his school, but it felt like a huge accomplishment. As they walked into the gallery, Lucas's artwork was displayed alongside other students' creations. The pride Mark felt in his son was overwhelming. Lucas had always been quiet, but through his art, he was expressing himself in ways that words couldn't. Mark could see the growth in him, the confidence, the joy, the sense of belonging. It was a moment Mark would never forget. As they stood there, admiring Lucas's work, Emily appeared at his side. He's amazing, isn't he? She said softly. Mark nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He really is. Emily smiled and placed a hand on his arm. And so are you, Mark. The words caught him off guard, but they resonated deeply. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like that was enough. As the night went on, Mark watched Lucas interact with the other students and their families. There was laughter, excitement, and a sense of community that Mark hadn't realized he was missing. He realized that his life was no longer defined by the deals he closed or the wealth he accumulated. His life was defined by the people he loved and the connections he made. And that was everything. Mark wasn't sure what the future held, but as he looked around at the people who meant the most to him, Lucas, Emily, and the life they were building together, he knew one thing for certain. He was exactly where he needed to be.